That's what we're interested in. Who is not a Jew? So the interesting tshuva of the Gaonim is Rav Yehudai Gaon. According to Rav Yehudai Gaon of Surah, from 757 to 761, Chalitza is not required in the case of an apostate Levir Yavam. So what's the case here? The case is of two brothers. This is Torah law. One of whom, the older one, in the classical case, dies childless. He was married. He leaves a widow, but no children. The younger one, according to the Torah, should marry. The different type of marriage, but he's immediately, as it were, linked. There's a zikah, a link with the widow, and he will basically move in with her and will name, if you like, the first child after the dead brother, so that there will be a continuity for the oldest boy in the family. Okay, Al Shem Achiv Hamet Yakim et Zar'o. So this idea of continuity, by the way, is a very interesting one because it is, I said in the classical case, it is the older one who dies, the younger one steps in, but it could be any of the brothers. So they will step in and do what we call yibum. But there is also a release called chalitza, ceremony involving a shoe, spitting on the ground in front of the recalcitrant brother who will not do yibum with his older brother's widow. So all this is very interesting, very, very fascinating. I could spend a few hours just talking about the various cases here, because first of all, yibum, marrying one's sister-in-law, is not usually allowed, okay? But in the case of yibum, it is. And Henry VIII tried to argue that when he wanted the Pope to let him annul his marriage with Catherine of Aragon. And he said, well, he shouldn't have married her because she had been married to his older brother Arthur, who had died in a shipwreck. So he is basically marrying his brother's widow. But because, this is very interesting, he said his intention, his kavanah, was not to fulfill the mitzvah of yibum, but just to see whether she was beautiful enough for him to love as a wife. So since his intention was evil, or not, pure, therefore he was actually committing a sin of marrying his sister-in-law as if the brother was still alive. So that's one interesting tangent we could go on. Another interesting tangent is that in an Israeli court decision about the use of sperm from a dead man, man has died, and they've taken his sperm, which you can do a few days after from the corpse. And the question is, can you use it without his consent? In Israel, unfortunately, when it comes to soldiers or soldiers killed in action, leaving behind girlfriends and fiancés, wives, okay, or even grandparents. And and Israel has a very liberal approach to the use of posthumous sperm. And a secular judge cited yibum as a principle of continuity. We have a principle of continuing the line in Jewish law, and you can take that over to this idea of posthumous sperm donation. Coming back to Henry VIII, we Ashkenazim always prefer to do chalitza. In other words, employ the release. Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid said, because we're not likely to actually be doing it for the sake of a mitzvah, and it's very close to an erva, a forbidden sexual relationship. And we remember when Yalta, Rabbi Nachman's wife, asked him for all sorts of dispensations to be able to taste forbidden things, okay? She said the Torah gives you a one crack at almost everything which is forbidden. You can't marry a non-Jew unless she's a Yefat Toar. you can't have a relationship with an erva, a forbidden close relationship, unless it is yibum. Then you can't eat pork, but you can eat shibuta, a certain type of fish, and so on and so forth. She wanted to taste a mixture of meat and milk. So he said, okay, I'm going to grill you an udder. And I'll do it in a grilling that doesn't entirely remove the taste of the milk. But whatever the case may be, I'm not sure how I got to this point. But the problem, according to Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, is that we don't really fulfill Yibum Lishma for the sake of the mitzvah. And therefore, the best thing is to do Chalitza. And in 1950, in the Takanat Yerushalayim, Rabbis Herzog and Rabbi Meir Ben Zion Chai Uziel, as part of their takanot for family law, instituted that Sephardim too will no longer do yibum, only chalitza. So Henry VIII has certainly halachic lines, a halachic basis, and used the fact that he was childless to prove that God was angry with him because he'd taken his deceased brother's wife for the wrong motivation. So there you are. It's a fascinating issue. But the question we have here in Rav Yudai Gaon's Tshuva is what happens if a Yavam has become a Mumar. In other words, the widow finds herself husbandless. She is a widow, no children. The next brother down is a Mumar. Now, what is a Mumar? Mumar is a serious sinner, somebody who commits really bad sins. Shabbat, public desecration of Shabbat is one, but it could be all sorts of things. He's clearly a long way away from being opgehitene Yid, an observant Jew. So this mumar, and sometimes he's even a mumar lahachis. There are two different types of mumarim in the Talmud. One is a mumar leteavon. You really need to eat your treif pork, okay? You cannot resist. He's treated a little more gently. But the mumar lahachis is somebody who knows it's wrong, says, I'm not weak, I'm making a point. I think that this law is a ridiculous one, and I want to challenge you all my fellow Jews. So here we have the one who breaks Shabbat in public and is happy to have all the other Jews see that he is breaking Shabbat because he wants to make a point. So the Yavam, the younger brother who's meant to marry with Yibum, his brother's widow, is a mumar. Now, the widow is not allowed to marry anyone other than the brother, because once the older brother died childless, the relationship between the widow and the next brother down is created by the death of the older brother. As I said before, you don't need a normal marriage ceremony. They are already linked. There is a zikah, a connection here. But he's a mumar. Are we going to force her to live with a mumar? Certainly not. But la bayi chalitza minei, she doesn't need chalitza either. If she doesn't get chalitza, how can she marry anyone else? We need chalitza. To this day, very observant women will certainly not feel themselves free to marry if they haven't had chalitza from one of the brothers. Okay? And the only brother we have is a mumar, and very problematic. And mumar can also include somebody who's changed their religion, who's become an apostate, a meshumad. They're no longer part of the Jewish religion. They become Christian or Muslim or Zoroastrian or anything else. Now, is that person likely to cooperate in a Jewish ceremony? Probably not. So it would be very tragic, and it would be a case of igun. Aguna, if this woman wasn't allowed to get on with her life without chalitza. And lo and behold, Rav Yudai Gaon of Sura writes in the Tshuva, which is cited in the Mordechai in Yevamot, that the Yavam Mumar, well, we don't need chalitza from him. Why don't we need chalitza from him? Well, one way of interpreting it is to say he's not Jewish. He is so totally divorced from the Jewish people, he's no longer Jewish. Can you denaturalize Jews? Can you? Shmuley, can you unmute? We want to hear you.
No.
No. Well, the answer is no to your no. Let me cite you a Gemara in Yevamot, Yud Zayin Amud Aleph.
Yes.
An interesting question is raised. A Jewish woman marries a non-Jewish man. Is there any halachic validity to that marriage?
No.
No. Oh, but why might he not be a descendant of the 10 lost tribes? Now, if he's a descendant of the 10 lost tribes, Reuven, Shimon, they are Jews. So this is a good question that the Gemara asks. And what is the answer? Shmuel, the Amorah from Babylon, okay, from Pumbedita, what does he say? Lo zazu misham ad she'asaim goyim gemurim. We declare there and then, who is Lo zazu misham? The sages of the Tanakh. As soon as the 10 lost tribes got lost, the sages of the Tanakh got together. The only source we have for this is Shmuel, okay, the Babylonian Amorah. They officially declared them to be Ois Yidden, no longer Jews. There you are. So, and then let me ask you another question. How about Shomronim, Samaritans? Are they Jewish?
No.
No, but weren't they converted in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah? And if somebody is converted to Judaism, the conversion holds. So, same question arises with a Shomroni. Now, the interesting thing is that the Gemara and also the Rambam take the same line and say, Lo zazu misham ad she'asaim goyim gemurim. When they realized the difficulties we would get into if we regarded the Samaritans as being Jewish, then you have problems of marriage and divorce. We have all sorts of problems. So therefore, we made them officially into non-Jews and we denaturalized them. So we have two groups who were denaturalized. How about Mumarim and Meshumadim? Why not denaturalize them? Indeed, Rabbi Prof. in the 19th century suggested in one of his letters that all Reformed Jews should be treated like the 10 lost tribes. They should be officially denaturalized. But we'll just skip over that. In any case, one way of looking at this is to say that we can denaturalize seriously problematic Jews. Okay.
So if they were to do tshuva, if they do tshuva, do they have to be Megaya?
That is an interesting thing. Yes and no. The tshuva, as we will learn in one of our Responsa in relation to the Moranos, when you came back to the fold, what did you need to undergo? Tvila. You needed to be bathed in the ritual bath, which is a type of quasi-giyur. According to some, yes. According to some, no. We will investigate that. There's definitely the concept of losing your Kedushat Yisrael. So just like you dip in your plates, purchased from non-Jewish manufacturers into a mikveh to introduce them into Kedushat Yisrael, so somebody who has left the Jewish fold, has become a Catholic, wants to come back, got to be dipped in a mikveh. Okay? So yes and
Must have bris milah also?
If they're not circumcised, sure. But they have to have a Brit Milah because they want to belong to the Jewish people. And there's a famous case of Shlomo Molcho, who was in fact a cardinal secretary who wanted to become Jewish. He made a lot of trouble for the Jews, but he circumcised himself. And he reports about the agony and the loss of blood. Not pleasant when you're in your 40s to have to circumcise yourself. Okay, but the official ceremony of reintroduction to the fold was dipping in a mikveh. So there is a sense that I'm only adding nuance to this idea that even if you are a mumar, you still need to do something to get back. Of course, I've cited to you two groups, major big groups, 10 lost tribes, a whole group of Samaritans. Now the Samaritans, where do they come from? What story do we tell? What's our Samaritan narrative? These are the converts in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. What made them convert? Beginning with L, with a big mane, ending in N. Lions. They're the Gerei Arayot in Aleph, in Masechet Yevamot Daf Kaf Daled. They are the ones who became Jewish, as it were, because there was a plague of lions, and God was clearly punishing them for not being part of the Jewish people or believing in him. So they became converts. But there's a question as to whether or not the motivation is sincere, and does that mean that they have a good conversion? Rambam was very dubious about their conversion and said that if they don't turn out to be good Jews, we can strip them of their Jewish identity. Although generally when it comes to Gerim, we don't. And the magisterial statement of the Talmud in Yevamot, Mem Zayin, is that if a Ger, Choser Suro, goes back and acts as a non-Jew, he is considered to be a Yehudi Mumar. He doesn't lose his Jewish identity. So how are we to distinguish between the 10 lost tribes and the Samaritans and the Mumar? The answer, of course, is one is an easily identifiable group and the other is an individual. And then I can come back to you, Shmuley, and say, in terms of an individual, you might do tshuva. But when sociologically speaking, you're part of a group that has a very different identity, okay? And it's a whole group, and it's a group shenitma'ah that has become assimilated, then you could say that we can get rid of all groups, which is why Rabbi Chayes, the 19th century, the Maratz Chayes suggested that we make all Reform Jews, because they're a large group who are intent on assimilation into German society. Let's make them into Goyim Gemurim. Of course, nobody took him seriously, but that's something that he did suggest. Before I go on, I'm going to point out something to you which we're going to talk about. What do the first four words mean? Ikad nisba ba'ala. Havi yavam. 4, 5, 6. Mumar, 7. Okay? Not needing chalitza is lo ba'i chalitza mine. You don't need chalitza from him. But what is the phrase ikad nisba ba'ala havi yavam mumar? What does that mean?
Where is that? Where is that?
That's the third line down, the first Hebrew line, which is Rav Yehudai's statement. Ikad nisba ba'ala, if when she married her husband, havi yavam mumar, the yavam, the brother, was a mumar, then lo ba'i chalitza mine. Now that may be throwing another joker into the pack. In other words, there may be another element here. Not only saying you don't need chalitza from a mumar because he loses his Jewish status, but it has to be when he was a mumar at the time of the marriage. Now, what train of thought does that begin in your minds? What are you starting to think of? It may not only be the fact that he loses his Jewish status, but at the time of the marriage, when the kala said to the chatan, when the present widow said to the older brother, I accept your kiddushin, perhaps she had a condition in her mind on condition that I do not have to undergo chalitza. In other words, that you do not die childless and we live happily ever after. So pay attention to those words. But now we're going to move on with the more simple approach and just say, well, Rav Yehudai Gaon appears to say that you can treat a serious sinner, especially an apostate, and as a non-Jew. And therefore, even in marital laws, marriage and divorce, he has no status and no privileges at all. So let's see. Jack, you're first on the line of speakers, so it's up to you. This responsum.
This responsum was presented to the Supreme Court as a halachic precedent in favor of the view that Brother Daniel not be recognized as a Jew for purposes of becoming a citizen of the State of Israel under the law of return.
Okay, I talked about Brother Daniel last time. Is it all clear? Can I just move on? Okay, the Jew, born to a Jewish mother, became a Catholic monk, wanted to come to Israel and be recognized as a Jew under the secular law of return. Okay, Jack, please. Silberg J. Justice Silberg.
Demonstrated that this is a minority view which was rejected by the later Gaonim, such as Rav Sadia Gaon, also Hagonim, Ivanot number 474, and came under heavy attack by many authoritative medieval codifiers.
Okay, so what we do pick up now is that perhaps our very definitive concept of Jewish identity never being alienable is not quite correct. Perhaps there was a possibility in the past of depriving Jews of their Jewish identity, even in relation to marriage and divorce. So the first section I have is from the Mordechai, by Mordechai HaKohen, 14th century, on Yivamot. Katuv b'tshuvat HaGaonim, the response of the Gaonim, Yivama shenafla lefnei mumar deptura min hachalitza umin hayibum hecha deleke yavam elahu. Okay? Now, Mordechai doesn't talk about the time at which the Yavam became a Mumar. He simply says that the Gaonim wrote that the Yavam, Mumar, makes the widow free and exempt from Chalitza when there's no other Yavam except for him. But they didn't bring any proof. V'chatav Rashi b'tshuva achat, and Rashi, and we'll read this tshuva or two or three, writes the la samchinan alayhu klal. We do not rely upon the Gaonim in this respect at all. V'afal pi shekata Yisrael hu. Pasuk from Hosea, pasuk from the Gemara, but a pasuk in Yoshua. Does anybody remember the context in which the Gemara says v'afal pi shekata Yisrael hu? It is, in fact, your book of Yoshua, Achan. Achan took from the city of Jericho, correct, Michael?
Correct.
And everything in there was meant to be left and destroyed. Nobody was meant to profit from it. Achan broke the cherem, he took, and then God says to Yoshua, who says, why did I suffer a defeat and the next battle down after Jericho? God says, Chata Yisrael, Israel sinned. To which, of course, the Gemara says, Afal pi shekata Yisrael hu. But this is a piece of Agadah. Rashi is relying upon a piece of Agadah as against a halachic statement of a Gaon. Now that is already challenging, and we're going to have a look at that in great detail when we get on to Rashi. But in any case, Rashi definitely supports our dispositive position and view. You can never lose your Jewish identity in terms of marriage and divorce and family law. It is inalienable. Ve'im kidesh kidushav kidushin v'choletz v'lo miyabed. The only concession is that if the mumar yavam, if the guy, the brother in cassock and crucifix, don't know how he could do that, would say, I want to marry you. So let's say he's become an imam instead. Then we say no. No Jewish woman is required to marry and live with a imam, okay? Doesn't make sense. But chalitza, yes. So this would be a case in which all communities, Sfarad and Ashkenaz, would require chalitza. And if he marries, his marriage is a valid marriage. This comports with the idea we have today, but clearly the Gaonim had a different idea. And the Bahag, for example, the Baal Halakot Gedolot, about the 9th or 10th centuries, he says, look, we find all over the Gemara references to the disadvantages of being a mumar. We don't let the mumar just go off and disappear. He is punished. He cannot bring a sin offering, he can't bring a korban pesach. The mitzvah to return a lost article doesn't apply to a mumar or a mushumad. Okay? His wine is treated as yain nesech. His shchita is nevela. His bread is the bread of shomronim, that's pat akum. His fruit is tevel. His books are treated as books of kishuf. Okay? Superstition and magic. His children are mamzerim.
But you speak about the mumar la avodah zara, about Achan was mumar le mitzvah achat.
But that was a very important mitzvah. Very important mitzvah. And he caused a tragedy for the entire people of Israel.
Yehonatan, the son of Shaul, but unwillingly also did not respect Cherem that they did on the...
But the circumstances, Jean, you will admit, are different. Achan deliberately went and wanted to enrich himself.
Yes.
Yonatan made a mistake.
Yes.
Okay, so nevertheless, what we have is a distinction between status and sanctions. We deprive the mumar of all sorts of things. He will not be able to inherit. You can lend him money, as we'll see in the medieval commentators, with ribit, with interest. So all sorts of measures may be taken against the mumar and the mushumad, but his status apparently remains that of a Jew at the baseline of family law, marriage, divorce, and chalitza and gittin. Okay? But let's have a look at the dramatic statement of Rabbi Yosef Karo in the Even Ha'ezer, okay, in his Bet Yosef on the tour. ומה שכתב רבנו, ולא ידענה למה לא תהיה אשת משומד זקוקה לייבום. ודאי קושטא דמילתא הכי, דאשת משומד זקוקה לייבום. Actually, the wife, the wife of a mushumad would need to undergo yibum. Okay? ואפילו קידשה אחר שנשתמד, even if the marriage took place after he became a mushumad. ואפילו בנו או בן בנו עד כמה דורות. And this would apply to the whole line of the mushumad, אף על פי שנשארו בשמדותם, even though they remain משומדים. כל זמן שהם בני ישראליות, as long as they are the children of a Jewish woman, or משומדות, or Jewish apostates, קידושיהן קידושין, ונשותיהם הישראליות, או המשומדות, זקוקות לייבום. In other words, family law applies to the mushumad and the mushumedet and to their children as long as they are born to Jewish mothers. And this is Rav Yosef Karo in the 15th and 16th centuries. וזה דבר פשוט כבעתה דקותך. And this is as simple as, anybody know what that phrase, בעתה דקותך means? Anybody? An egg in a milk soup. Okay, the Gemara in Chulin talks about the beata de kutcha. If you have an egg in a milk soup, then is the egg milky or is it fleshig? Do you have a problem with kashrut? And the answer clearly is no, you do not. And there are different ways of looking at it. Rashi says because eggs are never considered to be fleshig, and Tosafot say we're talking about an egg that was taken out of the chicken. It hadn't been laid naturally, but nobody would imagine that an egg would be fleshig and you couldn't eat it in a milk soup. So what is as simple as a beata de kutcha? Kvar katav kein mahari kolon, Rabbi Yosef Kolon, 15th century Italy, b'shorish peihe. ויש לתמוע מי שעלה על דעתו היתר זה, Now, who would think that you could exempt the wife, the widow, from having chalitza from her late husband's brother because he is a mushumad? Ve'al Rav Yehudai shenichtav bishmo, but Rav Yehudai Gaon and the Gaonim were very important. As we said last time, the Gaonim basically made rabbinic Judaism for the entire Jewish world. They answered questions about the meaning of the Talmud. They laid the foundations for Jewish prayer, the Seder of Amram Gaon, and they established customs, rituals for the whole of the Jewish people. So they have tremendous respect. So even though Rabbi Yosef Karo is a dominant figure, he respects the Gaon, and then he says, Eini Tamea. I'm not surprised that something could be written in his name. Mishum de Gemire de Maor Einayim Hava. He was blind. Of course, if we say that somebody has a light in their eyes and they're blind, what technical term do we use to describe
Euphemism. Euphemism.
Loshen Sagi Noho.
Thank you. Loshen Sagi Nahor is what I was looking for. Michael Gillis gave us the English, but Michael Epstein gave us the Talmud. Loshen Sagi Nahor, correct, Michael Epstein?
Thank
Sagi is a lot. Nahor is sight. In the Jewish tradition, we don't like saying bad things because it might invite the evil eye. So what do? We say the exact opposite. So the greatest tragedy in life is often death. There is a Talmudic tractate that talks about the laws of death and dying. What's that tractate called?
Samachos.
Samachos. Masechet Smachot.
Oh, sorry, Smachot to you.
Smachot is happy occasion.
Maybe for the summer it might be.
We don't say somebody's lost their sight, we'll say, they're seeing really well. But we know that means the exact opposite. Okay, I can give you some more examples, but we will move on. Rav Yehudai Gaon was blind, and therefore, v'lifamim hayu talmidav kotvin bishmo ma shelo ala al dato. His students would write in his name things that he would never have dreamed of. Ian, unmute. 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 Now
if they say it's a terrible shiur, you know what they're saying.
What do they say, Ian? Enlighten us.
If they say it's a terrible shiur, you know it's the exact opposite, right?
Okay. Thank you very much. I will bear that in. Now, I haven't heard that one before, but I will now bear it in mind. And what happens when they say it was a good shiur?
No.
I suggest that we leave this to things that are to do with the evil eye. Okay? Otherwise, we'll get ourselves into a lot of unexpected hot water. Okay, anyhow, so one of his students wrote it and he couldn't see. So they could write whatever they want. But we will also be a little surprised, or more than that. How could the Talmidim write something that's so wrong? Bal Itur and Rabbi Abba Mari of Marseille, who in his book, the Itur, which is a lot of halakha of the Geonim, plus his own medieval stuff, She'etik divrehem yesh litmoa, we're amazed about him. Lama lo redafeim v'kitateim ad hachorma. Why didn't he pursue and uproot these students? The davar pashutu. It's absolutely clear. There's no basis at all for these words. Lo shum tzad semech klal v'oy lo lemi shemekel bazeh. Woe unto him who is lenient in this case. Now, the leniency, of course, applies to the woman, the Yavama. If the Levir, if the Yavam is a Mushumad, he's not likely to cooperate in the Chalitza ceremony, certainly not in the Middle Ages, or even in the early modern period. And the woman, therefore, is left high and dry. She is Jean and Aguna in terms of Chalitza. Now, it will not be the same as a married woman who is an Aguna, who before she gets to get, her children will be Mamzerim. But the children but the woman who's observant will not want to be married without getting a release from her late husband's brother. So the leniency is there, but the idea of Jewish identity being inalienable is more powerful, even though these rabbis, all of them, know that the results can be very tragic. So what is interesting is, in addition to the fact that this idea persisted, Rabbeinu, amongst various lesser-known halakhic works, like the Sefer HaItur, but the interesting thing is that the Meiri talks about what the Gaonim did. He doesn't go down the line of Rabbi Karo and say Rav Yudai Gaon had no idea what was happening. Michael Gillis, would you read various Rishonim?
Various Rishonim sought to find some justification for Rav Yehudai's ruling. Amongst them was Rav Menachem HaMeiri, who attributed it to the exercise of a special jurisdiction that only the Gaonim possessed.
So this speaks to the status of the Gaonim, okay? As we said, they're the pillars of Talmudic Judaism as it spread right through the Jewish world. Therefore, they have a special status. And as we'll see, and I want you to spot what he says. Would anybody like to tackle the Hebrew?
Ella.
Okay, Michael, go ahead.
Ella שנראה לי שהם סומכים על מה שאמרו בסוף פרק א' דיבמות על 10 השבטים שבתי דינים שבדורות הללו עשאום כגרים גמורים.
That should be kegoyim gemurim. Okay?
I'm sorry for not noticing that typo.
That is a typo, a serious typo here.
Okay.
So let's change that. Remember we talked about the 10 tribes?
Yeah.
Yeah. So goyim gemurim, let's make them into goyim gemurim. The mumarim and the mushumadim as well will be goyim gemurim because of the special status of the geonim. Merov ma, continue.
Merov ma shenitmeu bahem.
Because of the extent to which the mushumadim assimilated into the non-Jewish environment. And if you think about it, in the Middle Ages, the Jew apostatized, became a Christian or a Muslim. They had nothing to do with the Jewish religion ever again, okay? Because it was probably a capital offense to Judaize, to go back to being what you were. You would be executed or burned. So you could say, right, once they're out, they're out. V'hayu hagonim, Michael.
אלו זיכרונם לברכה, דנין שאף בזמן הזה נטמעים.
We're talking about the possibility of ruling out of the Jewish people an entire group that's entirely entrenched and assimilated in a non-Jewish, in an opposite religious world. They could be deprived of their Jewish identity even for marriage, divorce, chalitza, yibum. And that, by the way, would solve problems for Jewish women who are caught by the fact that the yavam, for example, or even a husband has become a mushumad. Will we need a get? There is a suggestion in the Itur that we will not need a get because once you become a mushumad, you've lost your Jewish identity. Now that is the Meiri in the 14th century explaining what might have been the Hava Amina, the assumption, the basic assumption behind Rav Yehudai's view. Rabbi Yosef Karo takes the easy way out, of course. He says, never written by Rav Yehudai Gaon, and we'll see this tension between the high respect due to the Geonim and the various pressures on halakha to develop in a different direction. Okay, so what we've seen is Yehudai Gaon, the Geonim, were lenient, and they were prepared to run people out of the faith like the 10 lost tribes when they are identified as highly assimilationist. But this view was rejected later on later on, after the 13th century, doesn't appear. It is entirely rejected. And we know that Rashi, earlier, 1096, First Crusade, Rashi was absolutely opposed to the idea that you could be deprived of your Jewish identity. And we're going to have to explore the basis for Rashi's determination. But the interesting thing is, of course, that unlike what Rav Karo said, the idea that we can denaturalize very sinful Jews, especially those who apostatize, is not new. And it does have a basis in the groups that were drummed out of the Jewish faith. Lo zazu misham ad she'asaum kegoyim gemurim. Okay? So it may be that the idea of an inalienable Jewish identity is a later one than the possibility of denaturalizing Jews. Now let's have a look at the Or Zarua. Bernie, would you like to read? Unmute.
Or Zarua. According to the Or Zarua, number 605.
Rabbi Yitzhak ben Moshe Or Zarua of Vienna wrote an Ashkenazi code. Okay, his son.
The reason for his decision was the use by Rav Yehudai of the rabbinic prerogative to cancel a marriage retroactively, called the Mekadesh Adata de Rabbanan Mekadesh.
V'afkainhu
Rabbanan Kiddushin Minei. This is an entirely separate question from that of Jewish identity.
Now, the Or Zarua actually goes in a different direction. I hinted at that earlier. Rav Yudai said, Ikad nas nisba ba'ala ham'ach haya mushumad. If at the time of the marriage between the couple who had no children and the husband of which eventually died, the brother was an apostate, it is, as it were, a condition of the marriage. So what the rabbis did, they didn't say we treat him as a non-Jew and therefore there's no need for chalitza. They said we annul the marriage because we are going to help the woman out, because we're going to read a condition into the marriage, which we can do because we have total control over marriages, and therefore we can annul marriages in special circumstances. And we will say that the marriage was never a marriage. So you preserve his Jewish identity, but you nevertheless help the aguna out. And that's the path that we are going to follow when we deal with aguna law, which is a subject of many tshuvot in later generations.
That means she can marry a Kohen?
Can she marry a Kohen? Absolutely, yes. Once there is no halakhic marriage, she can marry a Kohen. Ian, if you want to say something, just jump in, but unmute if you want to talk.
That means that as soon as the husband becomes an apostate, she is free. She's like unmarried at that point. You don't have to have the right. That's what we're saying then. That she's automatically considered not married. Is that right?
That is the extreme view. What we have in normative halakha, at least by a number of Gaonim of Surah and the later halakhic books such as the Sefer Ha'itur and the Bahag, the Baal Halachot Gulolot, is that in the case of a Yavam Mumar, an apostate brother-in-law, you don't need to make the widow get chalitza from him, okay? Because the basic approach, he's no longer Jewish. We've drummed him out of the Jewish faith. Now that was explained by the Meiri, okay, as being a special prerogative of the Geonim. They were so respected and they did so much to create the foundations of Talmudic and Rabbinic Judaism that they're regarded as if they were sages of the Talmud who had a lot of freedom to enact legislation, okay? And that's the mainline issue here. In order to explain that, I've just cited the Or Zarua because his approach is implicit in the words of Rav Yudai Gaon. Ikad nisba ba'ala ha'ach havi mumar. At the time of the marriage, if the brother, the younger brother who needs to give the chalitza, was already a mushumad, then you can dispense with the chalitza, because the rabbis can say, I consider that the marriage between the widow and her husband was on condition that she would not have to get chalitza from an apostate brother, which is a different tack. Okay, so the Meiri gives us the main tack. He's not Jewish. We consider him to be a mushumad, beyond the pale. She doesn't need to have the chalitza from him. Can go off and marry. An extreme version of this is found in the Sefer Ha'itur, when there's a view that you wouldn't even need a get from a mumar. Now that is an extreme view. Okay.
Sorry if I interrupt. What is exactly the difference between mumar and mushmad?
Well, a mushumad is a special type of mumar. Mumar is a serious sinner who breaks everything and does it in public and shows his contempt for the mitzvot. And a mushumad is somebody who's officially become a member of another faith.
Christian. And defined which mitzvot he breaks, the mumar? Is it defined exactly which, or is it like...
Well, most of the, we'll put Shabbat and Kashrut into that basket and say somebody who goes about publicly breaking Shabbat and who goes about publicly eating the worst type of non-kosher food is considered to be a mumar. Now, the mumar, there are all sorts of actions that could be taken against the mumar, as I said before. He doesn't get any inheritance. You can take interest from him. You don't need to return a lost article, but he retains his Jewish identity. Okay? Now, the Gaonim and later authorities base these sanctions on one word. What is the word in the Torah that's common to Yibum, Ki Yeshvu?
Achim yachdav.
The word ach, exactly. Lo tuchal litalem ki tire shor achicha. And achicha, lo tashich, okay? It's all achicha. Now, is achicha biological or spiritual? So what the rabbis did after the Tufat HaGeonim was to say that ach means your spiritual brother. So if somebody is no longer your spiritual brother, you can penalize him, okay? Therefore, you treat him as a non-Jew. His yain is yain nesef. His bread is pat akum, Gentile bread, okay? So for chalav, he can't be counted to a minion, okay? But nevertheless, according to the major view in the Talmud, which is that if a ger reverts, he retains Jewish identity for marital laws. That is the main line. But what we've seen is that there was quite a different view earlier on in the writings of the Geonim. Eventually, that view fell into disuse, okay? And now we all accept the view that once a Jew, always a Jew. We can talk about this a little more, but we will go through, okay? And we will see how much more we can get done this evening. However, it's important to know that the Gaonim were able, in their period, to, as it were, drum serious sinners, especially Mushumadim, out of the faith. Hopefully that is a complete answer. We're now going to read Rav Yehuda's ruling. So Justice Silberg considers Rav Yehuda Gaon, puts it in context, cites the Shulchan Aruch, says, of course, today that wouldn't count. And therefore, Brother Daniel is not going to be Jewish. Of course, he is ha'ach, which is funny, because ach is like yeshvu achim yachdav, but he's not an ach in spiritual terms, and therefore we do not need to give him secular Jewish citizenship, okay? Notwithstanding the view of the Geonim. Robert, can you unmute and just read the line, Rav Yehudai's ruling cannot therefore?
Rav Yehudai's ruling cannot therefore be regarded as a precedent for depriving brother Daniel of his Jewish status under the halacha. In fact, as J. Silberg determined, the halachic sources were irrelevant to the brother Daniel case, since the law of return is a secular law passed by the Israeli Knesset, and as such, its interpretation needs to be secular, not religious. In terms of a secular definition of Jewishness, the Supreme Court adopted a sociological approach based upon a deep affiliation with Jewish culture and history. Such an affiliation could never be attributed to an albeit halachic Jew who had converted to Christianity and become a monk.
No, it was a funny case, 1962, somebody who's halakhically Jewish, and he was not granted citizenship of the state of Israel under the law of return, which says every Jew has a right to be an ole. Interesting case. So the line we have adopted here is it's an unusual one, but could you possibly justify the Supreme Court's decision on the basis of Jewish law after all? Because we all thought Israel, who doesn't matter how sinful you are, you can be a ger and go back to being your Christian self, Muslim self, or whatever you were, and you will still be Jewish. No, there could have been an approach which could have been based on the Gaonim, the idea of the Yavam, okay, and it could have been based on the idea that there are many, many sanctions which are leveled against a Mumar or a Mushumad because they are treated as a non-Jew. They are punished. In fact, according to one of the poskim in the Tshuva, he writes that we are taking revenge. The Muslims do not allow a convert to Judaism to inherit from his Muslim father. So we said, okay, we're not going to allow a Jew who converts to Islam to be able to inherit from his Jewish father. So, you know, it came down to money there. But the combination of the two could have been enough to justify saying that Brother Daniel is not Jewish even by halakha. But that was not the line taken by the court. And Silberg J., who was a brilliant student in Volozhin before he went off to Germany to study law, and he sat on that amazingly eclectic first Supreme Court bench, okay, including judges from all sorts of backgrounds. Agranat came from Kentucky, in fact. But they all brought a lot of Jewish stuff, including Chaim Kohn, who, though he was a lapsed Kohen, was still an expert in Jewish law. And Silberg said, I'm going to go by the mainstream view. And once you're a Jew, you're always a Jew, and you never lose it. But if we go back to the Gaonim, that's not quite the case. And as I said, we find echoes of the Gaonic approach right down into the Middle Ages. So that's an interesting tshuva, Rav Yehudai Gaon, on Jewish identity, another major issue for Jewish life. And the next thing we're going to do is actually to do with Agunah. It's to do with the Moredet. So in the time that we have left, I'm going to set the scene, and let's read what we can see next. Caroline, do you like reading in English?
I try.
Good. Okay. One of the most significant takanot.
One of the most significant takanot of the Geonim permitted direct coercion of a husband to give a get to his rebellious wife, Moredet, namely one who claims that she is unable to engage in conjugal relations with him because he is loathsome to her.
Ma'isalai. I can't stand the guy. Makes my skin crawl. Okay? I cannot possibly cohabit and have sexual relations with this man. Okay? Now, the Moredet is discussed in the Gemara, in Masechet Ketubot. It's actually in the Mishnah, the 5th parak of Masechet Ketubot. And this is an interesting issue, I guess. What happens if, I'm speaking to the man now, if your wife refuses to sleep with you? What can you do? Okay. By the way, the Mishnah talks about a mored as well.
Yes.
A man who refuses to have sex with his wife. Now, according to the Mishnah, the solution is financial. In other words, the Mishnah says that for every day that the moredet refuses to sleep with her husband, okay, she loses a small amount of her ketubah. The longer she continues to refuse and to rebel, the more money she loses until eventually she could lose her entire ketubah. And for a man, we add a small amount to her ketubah for every week that he doesn't sleep with her, until at the end he has to pay out a huge amount of money. That's the Mishnah's solution.
The takana permits the bet din to coerce, but not to enact the gittin. They cannot produce the get. They can only coerce the husband.
Exactly.
In all cases in Jewish law, a husband has to give a get. The Torah says that the woman is divorced by her husband writing her a get. V'chatav la sefer kritut v'natan b'yada. That's how we end a marriage. By the way, does the Torah say anywhere if a husband dies, the marriage comes to an end? Michael?
Don't think so.
Michael, are you aware?
It's logical that it does. Logical,
Where?
because the husband's no longer there. You can't be married to a dead man.
But does it say anywhere in the Torah that marriage brings an end, that death brings an end to marriage?
It doesn't ring any bells.
Sorry? No bells are being rung.
No.
And we don't mean the whiskey, and we don't mean the Polish town, okay? Okay, so that's just something that I've thrown out. What's clear is that you need to have the husband give a get. Now, the question is, when can you force a husband to give a get? Now, can you force a husband of a moredet to give his rebellious wife a get? That is the issue we're going to be discussing. But before that, and this is the last thing we're going to say today, so I'm going to stop the share. Okay? The basic position in Jewish law is that the get has to be voluntary. Husband has to be willing to give a get. If the get is not voluntary, it's called a get me'useh, okay, which means a coerced or a forced get. By the way, the word me'useh means what? See, actually, we spell it in the Babylonian Talmud with a sin. That's a little puzzling. But in the Yerushalmi, it's spelled with a samach. And now it's much clearer. Me'useh with a samach is like isui. What is isui in modern Hebrew?
Massage.
Pressing down hard.
Massage.
Huh?
That's a get me'useh. You've beaten the husband until he says, rotzeh ani. Okay? Kofino to'ad she'omer rotzeh ani. But when will a bet din beat a husband or use direct force in order to get him to give a get? There are only 4 situations in the Gemara. In the Talmud, that is 1, a husband who has a terrible skin disease, and every time there's an attempt at sex, his skin flakes off in greenish gray little bits and pieces, which is not quite very romantic. The second is when he has a terrible stench. He works in an industry in Talmudic times where the stench and the stink was so great you couldn't get rid of it. So again, not a recipe for an idyllic romantic relationship. Number 3, impotence was also a reason for the bet din beating the husband until he said, I want to do what the bet din says. He never says, I want to give her a get. He says, I want to do what the bet din has told me to do, and it's made its wishes felt by the terrible bloody lashes I've just received. Finally, there is the case of absolute neglect. The husband doesn't fulfill She'er Ksut ve'ona, the 3 obligations he has to feed, clothe, and provide sexual gratification to his wife. He's left the scene entirely. In all these cases, coercion, according to Talmud law, is permitted. Did I mention Moredet in my list? The wife who says, I cannot stand sleeping with this man. No. So you can already infer from that under contemporary halacha, the moredet will not be able to get a bet din to coerce. Now, do batei din beat husbands today?
No.
Theoretically, yes, and practically not, because there is, I think, a tshuva from the Shah who says that today we don't bite men.
Well, officially we don't, because it's a crime. It's not the sort of thing that a bet din wants to go around doing, but it has been done way after the Shah, who lived in the 17th century, okay, during Khmelnytsky, 1648. And there was a group in the early 2000s in New York, okay, New York and New Jersey, Rabbi Mendel Epstein, for $60,000, you could get a couple of Haredim to beat up the recalcitrant husband, and they would beat him up pretty badly until he said, I want to do what the bet din has said, and he goes and he signs on the get. Of course, Rabbi Epstein ended up in jail for 7 years. But in Israel, you do have the possibility of direct coercion, including jail.
But not by
to have a husband put in prison if he does not give his wife a get, when the bet din has said there is a kfiyat get, that we would apply direct coercion. 4 cases plus a 5th one. The 5th, and this is my last word because we have come to the end, the 5th case which has been added to that list, which applies today, is the case of a husband who is violent towards his wife, such a way that her life is under a threat. This was Rabbi Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg, that sits Eliezer, in 2008, and he added this list, this item, to those ilot, which would enable a rabbinical court to send the husband to jail. Usually the threat of jail is enough to get the husband to cooperate and give his wife a get. But the moredet doesn't appear in this list. And what we're going to do next week at the beginning of the session is to see how the Gaonim dealt with the moredet, to see the status of the Gaonim, again, as very important, but the limits on their authority and their power. And again, it wasn't always like it is today. Okay, that's it for this evening, folks. Would anybody like to add anything? Marcel.
Rabbi, did you conclude that there's no biblical source for terminating a marriage by death?
I did. But in practice, as I think Michael Epstein said, it doesn't make any sense for a marriage to continue. So it must be a svara. It's based upon.
Interesting, but the Mishnah, the first Mishnah in Kiddushin, makes a fuss about defining a star for creating a marriage, and then but when it mentions beget ubamitat habal, just on equal footing, as though it's like they're.
But the get is written in the Torah. We have 5 psukim, but no pasuk about death.
Yes, but the Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry a almana.
A widow, right.
That the others are allowed.
Yeah.
And you have something in the Torah.
Okay, fine. You're right. You know, it's certainly, but as I said, it's not on the same level as get. Get is written. This we can infer. You can marry an almanah, exactly, of course. All right, Marcel, did you want to say something?
No, I was saying bye-bye.
Well, what? Bye-bye. Okay, I wish you well.
You as well.
And everybody, Jean, you're still there.
Yes, I wanted to say some things. First of all, you said, donc, there is a tshuva in Avnei Nezer, donc it is from the end 19th century, of a man for different reasons. They beated him, and then they took his passport, and then they forced him to accept some money because there is a rashba, and the tshuva wasn't a good get, and it was not a good get, not because he was beaten, but because there was a mistake in the name of the father of the woman. Donc that means that was not in Poland. There was use, I think, to get what
there was beating up of husbands, absolutely, and it went on, as I said, even in the 21st century in North America. If that's one way of doing it, okay, we could be a little more gentle, okay, and I'm just going to throw this out because it was very dramatic. There was a woman who was refused a get in the Hasidic community in Montreal, in Canada, Montreal, and all the women of the community got together. They said, okay, unless Rochela gets a get, none of us are going to the mikveh. She got a get. That's another way of doing it, not necessarily beating him up, but he was probably subject to a lot of pressure, possibly a little bit of violence, the part of the other men. We'll talk quite a bit about Agunah as we go through the history of the Tshuvot. Good night.
Last point, you didn't speak about the case of the Karaite. This is a very interesting case because Rambam was relatively lenient with Karaites, and I think that today we would not be lenient.
Okay, the Karaim is a separate thing. I talked about the Shomronim. They're very different to the Karaim. We'll have a look at the Tshuva of the Radbaz, a classic Tshuva on the Karaim when we get to the 15th century, but at present we're still in the 8th century and the 9th. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bruchim to you. Bye.